Welcome, students, staff, faculty, and community members to our 2023 kickoff event for the National Endowment for the Arts, Big Read Lakeshore. My name is Andrew Salagi, and I'm a senior at Hope College and an intern for the Big Read. I am from Arlington Heights, Illinois, and I'm majoring in secondary English education and minoring in secondary history education. The Big Read is a regional initiative that comprises Ottawa, Muskegon, and Allegan counties, and it is in its 10th year. This year we have 120 events and over 100 community partnerships. Our program has evolved over the 10 years, and we now not only have a Big Read program, but we also have a middle read, a little read, and new this year, a mini read for the youngest Lakeshore readers. Our Big Read book this year is Homegoing by Ya Jesse, and our little read book is Change Sings by Amanda Gorman. The middle read books are New Kid by Jerry Craft and The Door of No Return by Kwame Alexander. The book for the mini read, a new addition to the program this year, is The More We Get Together by Celeste Courtwright. All of these books explore the themes of home and belonging and challenge readers to think about the different meanings these words have for people across space and time. Thank you for coming to our kickoff event. We are grateful that you are spending your evening with us. This year we go back to some of the topics that we explored in our first Big Read program. In 2014, we read Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. We learned about and discussed Southern culture, issues of race and racism in the United States, inequity and injustice. We returned to some of these topics in this year's program with our chosen book, Homegoing by Ya Jesse. As a community, we hope to explore the history of slavery in the United States, Black identity, and return migration. Our goal this year with Homegoing is to help our readers understand the history and legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the complicated stories that come from both the African and African American sides of this era of history, and the elaborate stories that encompass the subsequent generations of their descendants since the first slave ships crossed the Atlantic. Joining us tonight are two esteemed Hope College faculty members, Dr. Fred Johnson III and Dr. Ernest Cole. Both professors will give individual presentations that will focus on the legacies of slavery in the context of history, culture, and identity. They will explore the role of neo-slave narratives in engaging official historical narratives of the past and their representations of the human experience. They will examine the attempts of African Americans to negotiate the struggle for integration and gesture to the possibilities of returning to their ancestral homeland, as both a recognition of a hybridized identity with Africans and the projection of an alternate and futuristic form of existence. There will be a Q&A after both Dr. Johnson and Dr. Cole's lectures. We encourage you to share your thoughts and questions about the book and the plethora of topics discussed tonight. I want to take a moment to say thanks to our sponsor for this event, Lakewood Construction. Lakewood Construction specializes in commercial architectural design and construction development and management in West Michigan. They have been a longtime sponsor of our Big and Little Read programs. We're grateful for the ways they invest in our community through programs like ours. Additionally, before we begin with the invited talks for today, I want to invite Herrick District Library's Dan Zubermeyer to the front to share with us one way for you to participate in our program this month. Our Big Read program is about reading a common book together as a community, but it's also about discussing and responding to the book's topics and themes together as a community. Herrick District Library's Story Project offers us one way to do this. Herrick District Library is one of our community partners, and they've organized an oral history project that provides an opportunity for Lakeshore readers to share and preserve their unique stories, experiences, and histories. Dan will provide a short overview of this project and share ways for you to participate in it. Let's welcome up Dan Zuber here.
Thank you. You just took about half my little spiel. But I'll just reiterate, the Holland Story Project is an oral history project, and it was born out of community conversations that Herrick District Library hosted a few years ago. And we found that participants in those conversations didn't quite fully realize how diverse the Holland community really is now. For a couple different reasons, but the main reason is that they didn't venture out beyond their immediate community. And so once or twice a year, Herrick District Library calls on the local community to share their stories around a common theme, very similar to the Big Read. And this year's theme is homegoing. And we chose this theme in collaboration, or I should say, we're very thankful we were able to partner with Big Read Lakeshore for two reasons. One, The book Homegoing has kickstarted numerous thoughtful and constructive conversations during community reads throughout the country over the years since it was published. And we want to highlight those themes of home and belonging. Same thing with the new kid by Jared Kraft with the middle read this year. And second, just out of pure curiosity, we want to know how members of our community would answer the question, what makes a home a home? There are so many people within the community where they were not born in Holland, they did not live their entire lives in Holland. Myself, I grew up in Wisconsin, I've lived in Arizona, I've lived in Michigan, North Carolina, and now back to Michigan. And so home, to me, means different things depending on which part of the country I lived in. And so I officially invite you as a member of the community to take part in the Holland Story Project. If I didn't touch base with you on your way in, we do have some more information on how you can participate in an interview, and I hope to hear your story soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. It's now time to introduce our first speaker tonight. Dr. Fred Johnson III is the Guy Vanderjagt 53 Endowed Professor of History at Hope College and has taught here since 2000. Dr. Johnson's primary field of study is 19th century U.S. history, specifically the Civil War. His other areas of expertise are 20th century U.S. history, U.S. military history, and African history. Dr. Johnson is also an award-winning public speaker, a member of the Michigan chapter of the National Speakers Association, and a member of Toastmasters since 2004. He advanced to the semifinal round of the Toastmasters World Series of Public Speaking in 2007, 2008, 2010, 2016, 2017, and 2018, taking second place in 2017 and 2018. Prior to his career in higher education, Dr. Johnson served in the United States Marine Corps as a communications electronics officer and as an infantry officer in the Marine Reserves. He subsequently worked as a production scheduler for Packard, Electric Division of General Motors, an operations specialist for Contel Page Telecommunications, and as a corporate trainer for Aircraft Braking Systems, formerly Goodyear Aerospace, in Akron, Ohio. Of note is that Dr. Johnson was our kickoff speaker at our very first Big Read program in 2014. He has participated in many Big Read programs over the years, so much so that we have a hard time imagining our program without his input, insights, and expertise. Dr. Johnson, on behalf of the Big Read team, thank you for your support of our program over the past decade and your participation in it. We are better because of your part in it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fred Johnson.
Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for coming out to share this time with us as we kick off again. And thank you also to Deb and Diana for having such confidence and inviting me to participate in this event. It's truly been a wonderful thing that she's been doing. And give yourselves a round of applause. You know that in a lot of parts of the country today, a book like this wouldn't be read. So give yourself a round of applause. I had this on the right drawn for me back in the 1990s on one of my jobs. At the time, I intended for the African continent to be looking westward, crying about the loss of his children, all the ones who would never be accounted for, the stolen ones, as they were called. And so much of what is going on right now relative to this title, Homegoing. Homegoing says a lot all by itself. Going home, meaning that you were there, you're not there now. Let's start here with Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, because he has a story very similar to what is articulated in the book. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, meaning 3 years after the Civil War. He never knew a single day in slavery, and that to some extent colored how he saw the world, how he interpreted the world, how he engaged with the world. In 1903, at the very start of the 20th century, Dr. Du Bois wrote a book entitled The Souls of Black Folk. He asked a question. Bear with me as I read. He said, between me and the other world, there's ever an unasked question. unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All nevertheless flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and get to the real question. How does it feel to be a problem? He went on to say, the Negro has been gifted with second sight in this American world. His new home. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals of one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Sometimes you hear people in academia, African Americans, saying, having looking through the veil, what he's talking about is looking through the veil. That veil includes some dichotomous identities. One from Africa, where ancestors were captured, then sold, some who were enslaved, others who were reduced to chattel as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery in West Africa was slavery by on a lot of measures the same as anywhere else, but it was far different than the chattel slavery that came to be the standard in Western society. That is, the attempt to literally reduce the human being to a thing in all ways and possibilities. Whereas in America, the narrative in America has been one where you can stay or go. It's home, but you're also an intruder. Home by default, no other choice, and very often treated as an intruder. Then there was this other part too in the American experience. Questions, long arguments in the 18th and 19th century, I mean long, serious debates where people really munched over the question of, are they really human? Now, from my standpoint in the 21st century, the problem is you really asking the question. But people sincerely did not know, or at least claim they didn't know. Are they fully human or some level of subspecies of humanity moving forward? The American Revolution did not clarify things. In fact, the American Revolution, 1775 to 1781, kind of muddled things. Now, from the British point of view, they offered black slaves freedom if they would go and fight for the British. Now, folk may have been illiterate, but they weren't stupid. They can tell who's enslaving them and who's offering them a better deal. And everybody thought that the British were going to win because back in 1775, the British were their era's superpower. They, of course, lost. So those Africans who fought on the British side went to Nova Scotia and were eventually taken to a place called Sierra Leone. On the American side, early on and often, a devil's bargain was made with the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, in writing his first draft, actually condemned slavery, condemned King George III, and the delegates from the southern colonies made him take it out. By the time you get to 1787, that devil's bargain, that compromise with slavery, chattel slavery, is still a present reality. What becomes the Constitutional Convention and the document that it produced called the American Constitution, which of course the preamble begins with, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility," asking for a lot of things that the American colonists did not have while they were colonial subject to the British. But the question that jumps out at me every time I read this is that in 1787, who was we? In 1787, we does not include Native Americans. We does not include women. We does not include even poor white men. We does not absolutely include black people. It turns out that in 1787, we is for a very narrow slice of society who are male and wealthy and white. So even most white people are not included in we, in the Royal Republic. Many years later, John J. Chapman, writing about the Constitutional Convention, will say, consider the first 50 years of our national history. There was never a moment during this time when the slavery issue was not sleeping like a serpent. It lay coiled up under the table during the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. That is a daunting, scary thought that was there just ready to take its first bite. We can hardly be surprised that America will have a double consciousness about this, talking about looking from behind the veil. How can you possibly have a nation that is dedicated to freedom and liberty? Or as Abraham Lincoln would say on November 19, 1863, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. How do you do that at the same time that you are making a space to nurture, care for, and strengthen slavery? Or in other words, tyranny, which is what it was. You can do one or the other, but you can't do both. In 1816, an organization was founded called the American Colonization Society. I kid you not when I say that for the people that founded this organization, they thought in their minds that they thought it was the best humanitarian gesture of the early 19th century. They could not conceive of a world where black and white people were living side by side in a constitutionally established democratic republic as free first-class citizens. So their solution was to send them back to Africa. Now, many people saw right through this and said, this is just another way of making sure that you can perpetuate slavery. Get rid of people, that is, get rid of the ones who are free. The ones who are enslaved will never aspire to anything other. In American history, it wasn't just Africa that people contemplated sending blacks to. They also contemplated sending them to Central America. During the 1840s, there was something called the filibuster movement. But eventually there were enough black people, slaves and those who became free, that went to Liberia and established a nation that was declared itself independent in 1847. The odd thing about Liberia, the tragic thing about Liberia is that these African Americans who went there eventually became called the settlers, the Americo-Liberians they were called. They went to Africa and did the same thing to indigenous Africans that Europeans did to Native Americans in North America. If anybody on this planet should have known better, it should have been that generation of individuals, but they did the same thing just to give their bona fides as being human beings and oppressing anybody a double underscore. However, Liberia became a sort of an American outpost. It has a flag that's red, white, and blue. A single star for the country. The capital is Monrovia after James Monroe. And the currency, the Liberian dollar. I was telling my colleague Ernest Cole that when I was there in the late 80s, early 90s, if you didn't know you were in Liberia, looking at some of those homes from the 19th century, you might have thought you were on a plantation exhibit in Mississippi or Virginia. The people went there with the architecture they've been used to seeing and built homes similarly. America's double consciousness and trying to find a home for what this means to be home in the 19th century for black people had an inflection point in 1819 when the territory of Missouri applied for admission to the Union. At the time, slavery as a national issue had been sort of an inconvenience, but it was this instant where Missouri applied for admission to the Union in 1819 that became a national debate. One that for the first time people began using these two words, Civil War. The possibility that this thing could explode into a national conflagration. It got so bad where Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States and now in retirement for at least a decade, Thomas Jefferson all the way back across the mountains and across the fields on his plantation in Monticello, even he caught wind of it. Imagine this. Thomas Jefferson is out there doing whatever Thomas Jefferson does. There's no Facebook, no internet, no radio, no TV. And yet he heard about this national debate in retirement. He was so upset by it that he wrote a friend of his, John Holmes, where he said, I can say with conscious truth, there is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve us from this heavy reproach in any practicable way. The section that is getting rid of that kind of property, for so it is misnamed. It is a small thing, which will not cost me a second thought. It wasn't costing him anyway. If a general emancipation, now watch this, if a general emancipation could be effected, emancipation and expatriation. So homegoing. Thomas Jefferson's solution to the slavery problem in 1819 is to first set them free, then kick them out, expatriate them, make them go home. There's a notion here that for blacks in America, they have no agency. There's always somebody going to do something with them. And so somehow there's a presumption that people have the opportunity, the authority to do something with people, reinforcing the notion that they're property and have no first-class citizenship or any citizenship at all. Thomas Jefferson went on to say, but as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. It would have been one thing if Thomas Jefferson had said we have the wolf by the ear, we can't let him go, but he qualified it. He said we can't safely let him go. Which means then, by 1819, we must ask the question, who had who? If you cannot safely let the wolf go, that means that you're doomed if you let the wolf go. So you are required to stand there and hold that thing, slavery, for as long as you could possibly do it, until something gives. During the Civil War, the idea of African Americans trying to define a home took on a new dimension, where black soldiers signed up to fight for a nation that had, on occasion, that had already literally enslaved them, had devil schemes to try to expatriate them, kick them out, that is, deport them. Then they signed on to fight for the Union. Frederick Douglass would later say that once you put a musket in their hand, a blue uniform on them with the eagle on the button, and the words U.S., slavery is pretty much done. On July 18, 1863, no, you couldn't find a more finer example of the attempt to try and say, we belong here, this is home, for all its faults, foibles, and warts. Then when the black men of the all-black 54th Massachusetts unit stormed uphill in sand at Fort Wayne, South Carolina. These are men who volunteered to be the tip of the point of the spear of the assault. They knew that morning that more than half of them would never come back, would never see daylight of the next day. So why did they do it? I've not found specific evidence, but my summarization is this. These black men on July 18, 1863, for whom people have been saying did not have the courage, the brains, the guts to fight. They had to fight to get into the fight. They said, if we do this today, if we lay down our lives today, we will do several things. One, we will buy, not the guarantee, but just the chance that our great-great-grandchildren might participate in first-class citizenship. If we lay down this carpet of blood, it will be a down payment on citizenship for our great-great-grandchildren. No guarantees, just give them the chance to get it. So we are going to tell history. We, this morning, lay down our lives. We know this is our last day on earth. We're going to do this. We're going to do this because without doing this, it'll never happen. And as it was, they did it, and it still took quite a bit for it to happen anyway. In the 20th century, home took on a new dimension. Is someplace home just because you've been there for a while? Because by the 20th century, black people have been in North America for a while. But you couldn't really call it home. Not at the start of the 20th century. Not with the Ku Klux Klan being a domestic terror organization. Let me put a fine point on this. When I say domestic terror, I mean terrorists as in ISIS, Boko Haram, as in Al-Qaeda, any terrorist organization that people love to hate right now, just because it's homegrown doesn't mean it's not any less terroristic. And also, just because a community or a nation calls itself a democratic republic, that works if you're out there. But if in your community people can lynch you, firebomb your homes, pillage and plunder, and handle no accountability, that's what happens in nations that have dictatorships. That's called tyranny. So inside of that Republican democracy, there exists the reality of tyranny, irrespective of what it calls itself. In 1903, Dr. Du Bois, by that time, he says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relationship of darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. It was a phase of this problem that caused the Civil War. No sooner had northern armies touched southern soil than this old question, newly guys sprang from the earth, what shall be done with Negroes? There it is again, the presumption that something can be done with them, as it's done with a car, done with a chair, done with an object. Du Bois went on to say, the history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world in Africa. But he also would not bleach his Negro soul in the flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood is a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. The double consciousness, the veil, the two-sidedness, coming from one, rejected by one, not finding their home really in the other. Some people, though, who heard America's constant cries to get out, go back to where you came from, say, you know what? You're right. You don't want us here, we don't want to be here. So Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century formed something called the United Negro Improvement Association and pretty much was prepared to say, we are out of here, going back to Africa. In other words, we're going to give you what you want. But never mind what you want. We're going to do this because it's going to be good for us. The problem with Marcus Garvey's movement was this. Marcus Garvey, in addition to saying we're going to go back to Africa, he said, lift your head up. Being black is not a shameful thing. Put your shoulders back. Walk straight. Why do you have some pride? For Americans of that time period, seeing black people walking around with pride, and asserting themselves and being confident was a red flag. It caused problems. So much so that Malcolm X, at the time, Malcolm Little, his father, who was a follower of Marcus Garvey, in Lansing, Michigan, was found dead on trolley tracks. They say he tied himself up and threw himself on the tracks and was run over. An amazing feat for a man that plans to commit suicide anyway. On February 20th, 1922, the state of Mississippi, senators from Mississippi, that state passed legislation that would authorize sending all black people in the state to Africa. Folks, this is the 20th century. By 1922, we fought one world war. We had master flight. In just a few years, we'll be mastering transcontinental flight when Charles Lindbergh flies across the Atlantic Ocean. This is not the ancient period here. But they went on to say we should send them all back to Africa. Clearly, there's an idea about homegoing, that black people are trying to make it in America, and others say you really belong over there. By that time, by the 20th century, as Dr. Du Bois started getting older, he essentially was growing very weary of it. He had been involved in something called the Pan-African movement, that is, the global movement of Africans to come together and identify their common denominator experience as people who are in a diasporic position. That is, you came from Africa, descendant, wherever you are, you're part of this common thread of the transatlantic slave trade. And being in America, having fought this all this time, Dr. Du Bois was growing weary in extremis. So, toward the end of his life, he said enough is enough. He had worked with Kwame Nkrumah, the first leader of the independent Ghana, in getting the Pan-African movement started and spreading around the rest of the continent. This is during the early 1960s when a lot of African nations were declaring independence. And Nkrumah invited Dr. Du Bois to come to Africa. Dr. Du Bois went, and on one trip just decided to stay. Born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, but after more than 80 years of fighting the United States, being told this is not your home, he went back to what he thought was his home. Homegoing. For this man that had fought, been the leader of the NAACP, the editor of the Crisis magazine, the lead publishing arm of the NAACP, he said, yeah, Africa's home. Clarence Page in 1996, who's a columnist for the Chicago Tribune, said this: most African Americans, if given a chance, would have chosen to be just Americans, ever since the first of us was brought here to Jamestown Colony in 1619, a year before the Mayflower landed. But that choice has never been left to us. Dennis, my colleague Ernest urged me to tell you all this. In the late 80s, when I was in Liberia, I was invited by the chief of the Voice of America radio station where I was working, part of an American team. He invited me into his village that evening, and my manager said, well, you know, there's been some things going on. The Liberian Civil War is about to start, so it wasn't exactly really safe. He said, but if you want to go, it's on you. I went. In that village that night, you have never seen darkness so that you've seen an African night with no moon. It was so dark. We were in his house eating. And I noticed after a while that all the windows were open and there were faces in each one of the windows. I said, Shannon, do you know that there are people looking inside your house as we eat? He said, yeah, they're here to see you. I said, well, I'm flattered, but it's kind of creepy. And then he said, we got through eating, and he said, it's time for you to go out and meet them. We went outside into that very dark area, and as I started walking through this great throng of people, the entire village had turned out. I started feeling all these hands coming from anywhere, just touching my body, touching my head, my shoulders, my back, and people were crying. All the soft sobbing, and speaking in their language, and I said to him, "What are they saying?" He said, "They are crying because they're saying one of the stolen ones has been returned to us." I would be less than honest with you all if I said that my cheeks remained dry. I sobbed with them, and people whom I didn't know. In that instant, 300 years of separation closed with folk I had never met before. Somehow, on a plane, not historical, I don't know if it was spiritual, but somehow we all knew that we were together, that we were related to each other. It was a moment that I never forgot. My colleague Ernest will now share his viewpoints on the book. Come on up, Ernest. Andrew, do you have an introduction for him?
I do, yeah.
Come on up.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for your presentation. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Ernest Cole. Dr. Ernest Cole is the John Dirk Workman Endowed Professor and Chair of English at Hope College, where he teaches post-colonial literatures of sub-Saharan Anglophone Africa, India, and the Caribbean. Previously, he taught African literature at Fura Bay College, University of Sierra Leone, the Gambia College, and the University of the Gambia. He has published 2 monographs, Theorizing the Disfigured Body, 2014, and Space and Trauma in the Writing of Aminata Forna, 2017, and 2 collected volumes, Emerging Perspectives on Sil Cheney Coker, 2014, with Eustace Palmer, and Usman Semben, Writer, Filmmaker, and Revolutionary Artist, 2016, with Uma Sharif Job. His essay, Decentering Anthropocentrism, Human-Animal Relations in Aminata Forna's Happiness, won the Abiosa Porter Prize for the best article on African literary studies, published in a major peer-reviewed journal in 2019. His current research is on return migration of the African diaspora, and his monograph under review is titled Black Bodies in White Spaces, The Challenges to Migration and Possibilities of Return. He is married to Everetta Cole, and they have 2 daughters, Ernesta and Tunde. Dr. Cole is heavily involved in our Big Read program this year, and we are so grateful for his participation, support, and expertise. Dr. Cole is giving 3 lectures this month, and spoiler alert, will be on stage with Yad Jesse on November 13th for our keynote author event. You don't want to miss it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ernest Cole.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Thank you, Deb, for organizing this event. Can you hear me? I'm going to take a slightly different approach than my colleague Fred, who has made a presentation from the historical perspective. I will be approaching this from the perspective of literature, looking at the text as a historical narrative. And so my topic is, why do stories matter? History, Black identity, and return migration. My name is Ernest Cole. But as you can see, and possibly hear, you can tell I am not British. I come from Sierra Leone, a tiny country in the west coast of Africa that received its independence from England in 1961 after 153 years of British colonialism. I am married to Everetta Cole, and we have 2 girls, Ernesta and Tunde. I am a storyteller. You may be wondering how come an African from Sierra Leone who speaks English with a West African accent come to be known as Ernest Cole. I have to tell you my story for you to have a sense of my history, my culture, and my identity. Without telling you my story, you wouldn't know that I am a descendant of freed slaves from America who returned home during the Back to Africa movement, who settled in the province of Freedom, now Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone. Without me telling you my story, you wouldn't know that some of my ancestors returned to Sierra Leone from Nova Scotia, as my colleague Fred just highlighted. Without me telling you my story, you wouldn't know that some of my ancestors returned home from Charleston in South Carolina, the Gullah people. And so what that means is I am at the crossroads of two historical and cultural identities. My African identity and my African American identity. I am Creole and can thus trace my origin to both Africa and North America. I am my story. My story matters. Stories matter. To deny me the opportunity of representing my story, or to question the articulation of my story, is not only to interrogate the legitimacy of my existence, it is to deny the social and historical and cultural forces that shape the essence of my being. To suppress my story is to deny the expression of my humanity. It is to continue to displace, to dispossess, and alienate me from the social collective, at the same time denying me the opportunity of intersubjectivity. I am a storyteller. My story matters. Chimamanda Adichie, in a now famous TED Talk in 2016, The Danger of the Single Story, tell us, among other things, why stories matter. I quote Adichie: "Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity." And so tonight, I would like to introduce you to two storytellers, the historian and the fiction writer on the one hand, and the black body on the other hand. The two tell stories, but they tell stories from various perspectives and entry points and viewpoints. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they contest each other, sometimes they complement each other. But they create the opportunity for many stories to be told, and to be told from multiple perspectives. Stories matter. Many stories matter, if only to create what Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories. To tell our individual and collective stories is to avoid the danger of the single story, of ourselves and of our nation. To tell our stories is to interrogate the power and hegemony that lie behind the official construction of narratives that define and continue to define others. Adichie warns us that it is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. Because power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. She concludes, so this is how we create a single story. Show a person as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. The African proverb is crucial in understanding this dynamic. The African proverb goes this way: until the lion gets to tell his own side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Until the slaves in the plantations get to tell their stories, the story of slavery will glorify the master. Until the colonized get to tell the stories of abuse by the imperialists, colonialism will always glorify the colonizer. As Adichie further notes, how stories are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Stories about slavery and colonialism are many. They have been told over centuries. The historian has done a great deal of work in representing history. The fiction writer of historical narrative has also done exceedingly well in directing imaginative experiences of history and presenting them in literary and creative forms of expressions. It is evident that the crux of the question, why stories matter, is deeply related to history and the cultural representation of that history, as well as its implications. In engaging the question of history and the telling of it, as the title of my paper indicates, I am compelled to ask the following questions. Please bear with me. What is the purpose of historical narratives? Why do such narratives, what do such narratives have to do with the national psyche or consciousness of a nation? Does it complement it? Contest it? Does it reinforce previous narratives? What is the work of history in the telling or the retelling of history? Who tells history? Can we re-historicize history? Does historiography allow for that? Should the fiction writer imagine history and create historical narratives? Will that be a distortion of history? Are they engaged in the work of rewriting or revisiting history? If they do so, should history be revisited? And by whom? And for what purpose? When we do revisit history, do those narratives replace the official narratives? Do they contest those narratives? And if so, what do we do with that history that has been excavated? What do we do with that history that has been unearthed? Do we place them in a conversation with the official narratives? Do we allow them to go to have a dialogue? And if we do, what do we do with what emerges out of that dialogue or conversation? When the slave tells their story from the plantation, how do we put that story alongside what has been written and officially documented in historical curriculums that we study? What difference will it make, if any? And if it does, what does that have to do with the psyche of that nation, who for hundreds of years have used that history as the one and only single story of this group of people? In an interview with Yagayasi that Yosita Koyala in Contemporary Literature's 2022 had, she said this about history and storytelling, Yagayasi. She said, to not engage history is an act of self-deception and ultimately destruction. It was the way people lived their lives on upper levels, not stopping to peer underneath. On this note, I would like to acknowledge the following. Homegoing can be read as two sides of the experience of slavery on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The novel challenges the official and historical narratives of slavery and the literary imaginative representation of the truths of this period in human history. It allows the reader to make deep and critical connections between history and the telling of the nation, or the construction of the nation. It puts us in a position to grapple with the legacies of slavery that are consequent on historical memory, on amnesia, and generational trauma. So I postulate that Jassy is asking not only the question of what is history, but also, and more importantly, what are we getting when we read history? And what are we missing when we read the same history? I say it again. Jas is asking the more important question. When we read history, what are we getting? But not only that, what are we also missing when we read the same history? Whose history are we reading? Whose history are we privileging? And for what purpose? And so if Jas is at fault, it is the fault of excavating a history of the horrors of human experience that affect and continue to affect the lives of generations of black people on both sides of the Atlantic. If her novel is on the list of potentially banned books, it is because it unveils a society's denial and unwillingness to confront the ugly sides of its history and the long dark shadow that history has cast on the present. But more importantly, opposition and resistance to homegoing misses a golden opportunity to see history not as past, but as present. And a present that not only illuminates contemporary situation, but offers a lens to shape and impact the future. In my conception of history, I argue that there is a sense in which history not only repeats itself, but that history never ends. And what that means to me is that we are always in history. But the past is not only in the present, but that it constitutes the present and shapes the future. I would like to invite you to accompany me on a short walk through some of the crucial positions in the literary landscape Jas created in her novel. I intended to share the stories told of the historian Yao and those of the disfigured black bodies of Efia, Ness, and Akwa. Please remind me during the Q&A to talk about this. I may not have time to go into it at this point, but remind me in Q&A to talk about the scars of history and what that represents. But I want to begin with the first day of Mr. Yao's class, his history class. He uses an interesting construct for his history class. On the very first day, when students will be nervous about taking that history class, he says, history is storytelling. So what Mr. Yao does is to get his students to recognize the many versions of history and to begin to contemplate the truths about that history. He says to them, a good many of you will have heard my story, the scar on my face. What have you heard? What have you heard? And from one student to the other, they will give different versions of what they have heard. And then at the end, he said, which version is true? I've heard so many versions. Which version is true? And one student said, we would never know. He said, why? He said, because we weren't there. And then Mr. Yao said, well, this is the problem of history. We're dealing with something for which we're never present. And so it makes sense not only to have a multiplicity of the different versions, but to begin to acknowledge what we're missing and what we have. He says this is the truth about history. So using the circumstances surrounding his own bodily scarification, he will ask the students on the first day of class, what story have you heard about my scar? He received a variety of responses. He says, which version is correct? The student says, we will never know. He said, this is the problem of history. And so he makes this profound statement. We believe the one who writes history is the one who has the power. He's the one who gets to write the story. So when you study history, you must always ask yourself, whose story am I missing? Whose voice was suppressed so that this voice would come forth? Once you have figured that out, you must find that story too. From there, you begin to get a clearer, but yet still imperfect picture. Telling our stories, telling our many stories, makes it possible to recognize voices that were once silenced, and provides the opportunity of centering those voices along with what was the dominant voice or the official narrative. It not only allows for the excavation of marginalized stories, but it recognizes that the notion of a conglomeration of stories and the recognition of polyvalent voices, multi-perspectivism, is critical to social cohesion and national identity. The other storyteller I want to briefly introduce you to, I see the time. Again, I'm going to be talking about this during Q&A. Is what I call the disfigured black body as a storyteller. And the scars on the bodies of fear, of ness, of age, of Yao, and Aqua. What do stories, what stories do disfigured body tell? And how do we align those stories with official narratives of history? I'll come to that during Q&A, but let me just end here. I believe that the disfigured body, or the scarified body, or the mutilated body is a storyteller. It tells the story of its dehumanization, of its isolation, of its domination, and the sense of humiliation and shame that's going to come from the process by which the body was scarred. But it also tells the story of resistance. It also tells the story of resilience. It can also tell a story of agency. So the power of this scarified body lies not in its ability to tell the brutalities or the dehumanization of the past, nor its resistance. It's its capacity to tell both stories at the same time. In this way, it overcomes its limitations and it transcends the restrictions. So I read the scars on Yao's face as a scar of transcendence. And so the novel ends on Jass's use of this trope of homegoing on a broader level to represent the meeting point of centuries of a history of separation in the union of Marcus, the descendant of one of the sisters, Essie, and Marjorie, a descendant of the other sister, Ephia. We must understand that the title of the novel, Homegoing, plays out in many different dimensions. Homegoing itself it stems from the African celebration of the dead. When the dead body is about to be returned to the earth, back to the ancestors, we call it homegoing. It is a celebration. It is feasting and dancing and drumming. The body is going back, is returning back to the ancestors. That is the land of peace. That is the land of stability. That is where we all will end. That is the only real estate that we own. And so Jazz is playing on this age-old African tradition of homegoing, of eternal peace and happiness as a trope to deploy onto the African American suffering and the possibility of accomplishing that peace if they can go back to the fatherland. That's why she had to bring the descendants, great descendants of generations of two sisters in unity. But that unity has to take place in the fatherland. It cannot take place in the United States. They have to go back to the point of origin. They got to go back to Ghana. And that is where that union is going to be solidified. In a pivotal moment at the end of the novel, while visiting her birthplace of Ghana, Marjorie gives her stone necklace to Marcus, her African-American friend. Unknown to her, that Marcos is the descendant of Mame via Essie. Her offer of the necklace is a cultural baptism. It is a rite of passage. It is an initiation into the ways of the tribe. Remember, the slaves were deliberately prevented from keeping their customs and traditions on the slave plantation, even from speaking their language. And so over centuries of time, the African American lost connections to their cultural roots. But in Marjorie handing over the necklace to Marcos, she's saying, welcome back into the tribe. This is the rite of passage. Welcome home. What Marjorie offers him in essence is what the African offers the African American. An invitation to begin the process of negotiating their cultural heritage and ancestry in the fatherland. This invitation is crucial, for it demonstrates that Africans and African Americans are two members of the same family, separated by time and history, but have tremendous potentials to negotiate the possibilities and overcome the challenges that come with this invitation. A new identity in Africa. Marjorie's gesture is proof that the continent is waiting for you. We are offering you an invitation to participate in the reconstruction of our common homeland. Remember the Asante proverb that Jassy uses at the opening of the novel. The family is like the forest. If you are outside of it, it is dense. If you're inside it, you will see that each tree has its own position. You have a place in the fatherland. We will receive you with open arms. Will you join us? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cole, for your presentation. We will now open up the floor to questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and someone from our Big Read team will come around with a mic. Feel free to ask questions about Dr. Cole and Dr. Johnson's lectures, about homegoing, about neo-slave narratives, or anything else that they discussed.
Just go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question. Anyone? We know you have them.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm a student at college. Dr. Johnson, do you think that that nativist sentiment is still around today in the United States that you were talking about in your presentation?
The nativists as in the Ku Klux Klan?
The nativists in the sense of there's groups of people in the United States who want to, I guess, send people of African descent back to Africa.
Yes. Well, the thing is, Jack, let me put it to you like this. I heard this on the other day. When you look at how immigrants are being treated when they come to the country, and the kind of things that are happening right now, how race is being used as a cudgel for people running for office. You know, the commentator was saying this is not some offshoot of what we could do. People around the world, we look at ourselves like this. This is who we are. Now, not all of us obviously, but this is in our midst. And it reminds me of when I was living in Ohio. I heard about the Ku Klux Klan demonstration not too far from where I was living. And the person I was telling you about this said, they really shouldn't be allowed to do that. You know, they're just going to be just upsetting people. I said, no, they need to do that. They need to do that. Because when grown men get up in the daytime and wear sheets and hoods, I want to know who they are. I want to know that they're in the community. Because see, you can tell people about this stuff and they think you're making it up, but you can't deny what your eyes have seen. They're out there, they have those sentiments, and how we deal with that is going to be a test of the democracy, but yes, they're there.
Thank you for that question. I think the idea of African Americans going home has been presented in more of a negative light in the United States than a positive sort of, aspiration. And I think at one level, Jassy is trying to not necessarily correct, but at least to complicate that kind of perspective. I understand the fact that what home means is complex. It means different things to different people. And for some people, home is where you find yourself. Home is wherever you are, where the heart is, we say. But for others, home has to do with a particular place and the social dynamics, the cultural conventions that sort of define that place. I may have stayed in the United States for 16 or more years, but I'm sure I bring with me my Africanness. That is who I am. That is the formative experience of my childhood. That is what I relate to. That is what I know. That is me. I take the fact that over centuries, the African American has lost contact with Africa. The Africa they left is no longer the Africa that is at present. How they see Africa is also different from the way the African sees Africa. Is it a single story of Africa that the African American sees? When I watch TV in the United States, it's always about starvation and hungry people and civil wars. Maybe that's the danger of the single story at some point, Adichie is saying. But I take the point, to go back to Africa is complex. But while the content of Africa may have changed in terms of the transformation that have occurred, the principle and the spirit itself of coming back home and reconciliation and healing between these two families of the same common ancestry is still alive. That I can tell you.
Now, when Ernest was giving his presentation, I kept thinking about something that Winston Churchill said when he started writing his multi-volume set on the history of World War II. Churchill said, "History will be kind to me because I intend to write it." So when you have that kind of story, that kind of guarantee, so he's right, whoever's holding the pen or doing the typing will have, and we all have perspectives, we're going to get their version of it, which is why, just as you said, a multiplicity of storytelling, looking at it from all angles. We talk about this in historiography, right? Looking at it, the history of the history. So the history, for example, in America, post-Civil War, is one where William Archibald Dunning tells the story of a South that's beleaguered, bedraggled, black soldiers are running around doing all kinds of terrible things, stuffing ballot boxes, and preying upon people. Well, it was the story that most Americans at the time wanted to hear, so it was invented, and sadly enough, it was taught at Columbia University and other schools, and it became the narrative that we had to live with. And it didn't start getting deconstructed until other scholars like John O. Franklin began putting out counter narratives in the 1970s and the 80s. Now we have a fuller presentation of Reconstruction, but likewise, that storytelling of that era presents us yet another opportunity to say, the people that did that storytelling, they too provide an avenue of study. So it's an ongoing process, and we do ourselves a disservice as a society to be not just citizens, but it's not just good enough to be a citizen, you have to be a functioning citizen. You have to be an effectively functioning citizen. I submit you can't do that without knowing your history.
Well, I think of two Americans who have contributed, I think, greatly to this understanding of the story is told in the body, and the story has also been denied to people. One is Henry W. Gates and his wonderful program on finding your roots, and the expression on the faces of people who find out about their ancestors. And they say things like, I never really knew who I was before this. The other thing is, when I was 13, starting high school, Emmett Till was murdered. I lived on the south side of Chicago, and many of my classmates went to see him. And his mother said, "Leave the casket open. I want everyone to see what they did to my boy." And the notion that the history is actually, in many ways, written on our bodies, in the trauma we carry, and in the beauty we carry. I found it very moving. Thank you both. Oh, and I'm a retired social work professor.
Thank you very much for making that point. I promised saying a few words about the scar on the bodies of some of the characters. I'm just going to isolate Ness quickly. There's a point in the narrative where, in the plantation, Ness was beaten severely by the slave master, nicknamed the devil, and the plantation itself was referred to as hell. She was beaten so badly that a huge scar ran across from her back, under her chest. It was horrible. It marked her, it scarred her. That is a very important point in the narrative, because what it says is the body of the slave is the canvas on which the master exercises power. The power of the master is actually deployed on the body of the slave. And so he brutalizes the slave in the process of the exercise and domination that he wants. In the process of brutalizing the slave is dehumanized. The slave becomes less than human. But guess what also happens? As the master brutalizes the slave, the master also loses his own humanity. So it became an instance of double dehumanization. Both the master and the slave are locked in this process of mutual dehumanization, and nobody is free. So while the scar in itself might in some way tell the story of the power of the master, it also tells of the dehumanization of the master himself. But the master needs to read that scar critically to understand that he too is imprisoned psychologically in the scar he has created on the body of the slave. Quickly, I know there are questions here. The scar on the face of Yao and his mother, well, at a point in the narrative when Yao went back home, another instance of homegoing, went back home to meet his mother, whom he has not seen since he was taken away and was living in shame and isolation. That body, again, is a template to with shame, the scar of humiliation. But then when he went back, at a point his mom said to him, the scars on my hands and the scar on your face is a warning to us. It's the consequence of our participation in evil. That is a very pivotal moment in the narrative. Because what Akoa is saying is that African complicity, Africans never got away from engaging in the slave trade. The African American on this side of the Atlantic might be in shackles, might be chattels, might be physically imprisoned, but the African was psychologically imprisoned. We were in psychological chains, not physical, in psychological chains. And the scars on her hands and the face of her son is a warning against participation in an event like slavery that dehumanizes millions of people over centuries. Sorry, I've been talking too much.
Well, you're about to talk some more. Professor Cole, great to see you again.
Good to see you.
In your research for your book, Disfiguring the Human Body, great work by the way, in your research, did you find a certain story that either inspired you to tell this narrative, or just a story in general that really stuck with you?
Wow, I hope I don't cry. It was in 2018. I got the Towsley research award at Hope that allowed me a pre-sabbatical and 4 years of research. And I left home in 1996. My wife and I left home in 1996. We went to the Gambia where we sought refuge during the Civil War. And from the Gambia we came to the United States. So it's been about 18 years since I left home. While on this side of the globe, I would watch documentaries and TV presentations of the Civil War back home. And I come to see people whose limbs have been hacked with machetes by the rebels. It was all about dams. Everybody wanted to get rich and get rich quickly. By the end of the Civil War, we had about 6,000 people whose limbs have been hacked with machetes. So I decided to go back home and actually document the stories of the amputees. Some of them I knew personally in my community.